Hi, and welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Network webinar series. So today we are joined by Professor Richard Wilding. Thank you, Richard, for joining us today. And today Richard will be speaking on biotechnology and the COVID-19 vaccine supply chain. Just before we go into the webinar with Richard, just a few words about the Enterprise Excellence Network for those who aren't familiar with us. So we are a community for senior lean leaders founded by Professor Peter Hines. Before COVID, we were running benchmarking workshops in host sites, but at the moment we're doing everything virtually. So yeah, very much focused around enterprise excellence for senior lean leaders. If you'd like to find out more about us, you will receive an email after this with some follow-up contact details for myself and also our website address as well. So please feel free to contact me. Okay, I'll just hand over to Professor Peter Hines, who will just introduce Richard Wilding a bit more for me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma, and welcome along to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm very pleased to welcome Richard to this this session, and we were just reminiscing before we turned on the go of how long we'd actually known each other, and we reckon it was somewhere in the sort of 92, 93 that we started working together when we sort of were forming the Logistics Research Network as an international network of academics in the logistics area. Since that time, I went off and disappeared into the lean world. And Richard continued on and has become one of the leading authorities on the global stage in the supply chain area. And using that expertise today, he's going to share some of the insights of looking at the whole vaccine situation that we're in from a supply chain perspective. So, so I think some very interesting insights for you. So Richard, welcome to the session.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. So, I mean, this particular session, Peter said, oh, can you talk a little bit about vaccines? I've been doing an awful lot of sort of media engagement, sort of commenting on it. First of all, just want to say I am not directly involved with the vaccine supply chain, apart from the fact that I actually do work on a voluntary basis in one of the vaccination centres in the United Kingdom. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on. So in a way, that's, as we sometimes say, at the coal face, or the sharp end is probably a more appropriate way of putting it. So I work there. So I get to see, if you like, the very sharp end of the vaccine supply chain, but also I do work with quite a few of the pharmaceutical companies involved in this, so I get some quite good insights into the types of challenges which are going on. And so what I'm going to be sharing during this presentation is some of those sort of insights and issues, and just give you a bit of background to how, if you like, some of that industry works, and how things move forward, because I think there's some important lessons that we can take forward. So just a very quick introduction to me. I accidentally fell into academia. I started my career in industry, and it wasn't my life's goal to become an academic by any means, but it just happened. And I describe myself now as very much a pracademic, a practitioner academic, because I work with organizations all over the world. I've been a former chairman of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport. I'm also on the global board of trustees for SIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Cranfield's a little bit different because we're a totally postgraduate university specializing in technology and management. I was one of the first professors of supply chain risk management, and very much my goal is knowledge into action. As I say, I really see my goal as challenging and inspiring business and supply chain leaders to innovate. So what I'm really hoping is that, from this session, you're just going to be able to innovate a little bit more, and take some of these ideas and take them into your world and do something with them. Okay, in Cranfield, we work globally with all sorts of different businesses. So, we're very much a global organization. And so it's always great to talk to global audiences. So what I want to actually go through during this particular session, and I want to talk for probably around about sort of 25 to 30 minutes, and just set the scene, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So first of all, the bimodal supply chain. Okay, and one of the things we're finding, we're being forced into exploration. I'll come on to that. I want to talk about biotechnology and vaccine supply chains and some of the lessons and challenges in that environment, growing supply chain resilience, and also moving towards the new better, the new normal or the new better. You know, sometimes people talk about the issue of the new normal, but actually, you know, I think we have to be positive about this, because some of the things that we're actually doing are going to be creating a much better environment and a much, you know, much improved environment. We could argue we've been relatively lazy within many supply chain environments for a very, very long time, and having this massive burning platform and disruption, it's actually enabling us to do some really different things within our supply chain. So just start off with a definition here. Innovation is all about creating value, economic value, social value, and or environmental value through the application of ideas which are new to you. So really, I use this because at the end of the day, what we want to be able to do is, you know, I sometimes rephrase this and say innovation is all about taking ideas which are new to you, right, and creating value. So I'm hoping that I'm going to be sharing some new ideas with you, and you might be able to take these and just put them into your environment. So first of all, let's just reflect on supply chain strategy, and this is really quite important when we think about the, you know, just the way we're moving forward. So corporate strategy of the business, this generally it always reminds me, for most businesses, of you know, it's all about global domination. It seems, you know, it's like Dr. Evil on Austin Powers, you know, wanting to take over the world, and they want to be the biggest, they want to be the best, you know, in terms of what they're actually doing. But it starts to get interesting for me at the competitive strategy bit. The competitive strategy is generally all about how you create demand. So this is often your marketing, sales, commercial teams. How do you create demand? And that's all about how do we create value for a customer. And this is really important. What is the vision that we're trying to achieve? How do we create value for that end customer? So really important. And the supply chain strategy is really all about, if you like, how do we deliver that value? It's all about demand fulfillment. And there's actually then 4 key things that we need to sort of consider. This is in simple terms. You've got to think about the process, supply chain process design, the infrastructure design, the information systems design, and if you like, the supply chain organization and people design, which also includes the skills which they have. Now, this is actually quite important when we come on to the vaccine supply chain, because if we think about the product characteristics that we have, you could say that what we're trying to do is to create value. Why? By inoculating the world. But each of those different, if you like, product types. So if I look at the Pfizer vaccine, there are certain things that you have to have in place in terms of the processes. You have to have certain infrastructure in place to manage that, because it's one which has to use ultra cold. So, you know, it's -60 to -80 degrees Celsius, and we'll come on to that. The information systems associated with that as well are quite, you know, specific, because the monitoring intelligence systems you need to have in place as you're moving these through the supply chain is absolutely critical. And then, if you like, the skill sets of the people at all stages in the supply chain, including those people who were, you know, my colleagues in the vaccination center. If I'm handling the Pfizer vaccine, it's actually very different to the AstraZeneca vaccine in terms of, you know, how you manage it, what you have to do, and so on and so forth. So there's different, you know, different elements to this. And at the end of the day, all those little areas come linked together to create that overall competitive advantage. Now, what we've been seeing, of course, is over the past few years, so if I go back to the old normal, what we were finding was this whole concept of, you know, supply chain 4.0. It was all around, you know, taking core principles of industry 4.0 and really starting to apply them across the supply chain. So things like systems, you know, integration, big data analytics, simulation, virtualization, Internet of Things, the cloud, cybersecurity, autonomous systems, augmented reality, additive manufacturing. I would put cybersecurity as number one thing that we need to consider. In the last couple of years, this has really moved to the top of the agenda for nearly all organizations. And sadly, what's happening is supply chain systems are now being the things which are actually being attacked, and also the attacks occurring through the supply chain. So the fact that we need integrated supply chains with integrated systems, it makes us slightly more vulnerable. So this is an area where we're having to actually spend some time. And I used to say the planets are aligning, right? But actually they have aligned. Some of the predictions we were making at the back end of 2019 for, if you like, you know, big moves forward, I was sort of saying in the next 5 years we will see this, in the next 5 years. Well, actually what happened was we saw it in 5 weeks or even 5 months, in massive acceleration due to the burning platform of the pandemic. So moving on then, that leads us into this concept of the bimodal supply chain. Mode 1 is a real focus on predictability, its efficiency and cost reduction, managing predictable swings in inventory fluctuations and focusing on risk mitigation and prevention. You know, and you could say that that's very akin to, if you like, many organizations' interpretation of lean. Mode 2 is, if you like, focus on exploration, speed, it's dynamic, it's iterative, it's strategies for solving the unexpected or adopting to new technologies. And, you know, this, in a way, it picks up on this concept of, you know, agility within the systems. And people were saying that organizations need to learn to manage both simultaneously. The thing is that if we go back to the old normal, what we generally found within organizations, probably about 80% of what we had would be mode 1 and 20% mode 2. The problem is in the last 18 months, it's completely and utterly swung over. And now we're in a world where actually you could argue for many, it's, you know, mode 2 is 80% of what they're actually doing. And therefore that actually requires completely different sets of processes, infrastructure, equipment, network, as it were, the information systems, and also the people skills associated with this have actually changed. So, you know, we have to recognize that there's been this big shift which has occurred. Now, when we start to actually think of the nature of, if you like, the biotech and also, you know, vaccine supply chains and everything, one of the things that really characterizes, if you like, some of the, you know, pharma supply chains and the biotech supply chains is, if you like, a virtual integrated network. And what do I mean by that? What it means is that typically what we find is there is a network of suppliers out there. And what will happen is those suppliers will come together to create a supply chain for a particular period of time to deliver value to a particular customer, and then effectively it dissolves. It doesn't completely disappear, it dissolves, and the nature of the relationships change. So you'll have highly integrated relationships between these organizations, but then what then happens is over time, you know, to create the value for those end customers, that has been potentially achieved. So then the relationships are still maintained, but they become more distant, and they look for another opportunity to basically resurrect a new network, as it were, within this. So that's actually quite important, because when we move on to then think about biotech and the business model, we've got this biotech sort of evolution matrix, and there's actually 3 dimensions to this, and this is really important. whenever you're looking at, say, a drug, a vaccine, any, pharma type product, or even something which is used in medicine, and you could say that this model in a way can roll out across other things. To get things moving, you've got the network evolution. Okay, these are the people, the network you need to connect up to achieve that objective. You've also got the product evolution, okay, and also the funding evolution. And one of the challenges is you need to balance these out. So you can't get the funding evolution getting too far ahead of the product evolution, or the product evolution getting too far ahead of the funding evolution or the network. Otherwise, the thing becomes unbalanced, and actually it can then collapse as you're going through this. So this is one of the things that organizations in this sector are having to do, is to really sort of think through these various areas. So what I want to do is just reflect on these and show you some examples and link it in with the vaccines as well. So, okay, product evolution pipeline, and we talk about type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is, if you like, a drug. Type 2 is generally a more medical type entity that is going through this. I'll come on to that in a minute. But basically, this is the process. So what you have is you have discovery. You might start registering a patent on things. You then have clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And generally for a biotech company, what they want to do is to sell it to big pharma. So if you think about the Oxford vaccine, at the end of the day, what they did was they were doing all their work. They've got a little organization there, and then eventually they get that technology to a point that they say, right, we need to get a big pharmaceutical company involved in this to help us move forward. And we've seen that as well with the Pfizer BioNTech. We've got that German organization BioNTech, which was set up by some academics. They're doing this, and then they try and actually sell it on to big pharma. Now, these are from in the United Kingdom, the UK in, when was it? It was probably December. They actually published the UK COVID-19 vaccines delivery plan. And I've just taken this straight from that plan. This is the traditional process that they actually present. So you can see it's, design and exploratory preclinical studies. They then do some toxicology. You then do clinical trials. You then do phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Then you do the regulatory work, and then you do the large-scale production distribution. Believe it or not, that total process, it is not uncommon for it to take 15 years in normal times. Okay, so this takes a heck of a long time, consumes an awful lot of resource. What they did was they accelerated it all. And a big part of that acceleration occurred because of what they started to do was they started running the clinical trials in parallel. So you can see there they got phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, more or less running in parallel. And they were able to actually massively accelerate what was happening through that thing. And the important thing there is rolling regulatory reviews. So at each stage, there was this continual, basically regulatory review taking place. And this was massive in terms of compressing the lead time that we've actually witnessed. Now, one of the challenges is the cash burn you have within this, because this data actually is probably it's a few years old, but I had a look around and very much ballpark figures. But you can see here 6 to 15 years just to get it to a point where you're starting making money generally within these supply chains. So you end up with a massive cash burn to be able to get these things actually moving. And what's interesting, and the debate which has taken place about patents, right? Patents, really important. So you will raise a patent on this, and basically the patent is valid for, I think, with medical, medical products. And I'll stand corrected on this. I do know it, but I've forgotten it. I think it's 20 years, all right? And the problem is that this whole, you'll raise the patent, everybody knows then what you've patented, but then you've got a number of all this big process which takes place, and then you've only actually got a very short period of time to make some money out of it before the item goes generic. Okay, as soon as it goes generic, all the price drops. So if you think about, I don't know, another Pfizer product, I'm on one, clopidogrel, right? That is a particular drug. Pfizer developed it. It's basically equivalent to aspirin in terms of, you know, reducing clotting. Okay, they had the patent on it. They pushed it through, but they only had a limited period of about 4 years to make their money off that before it then went generic. And now everybody can make it and everybody can sell it. So this is actually quite important when you think about the funding and the innovation which takes place within the industry. Now, the New York Times decided to do something called a vaccine tracker. Okay, I've got here. It's just run for a year now, so it's quite interesting. Because if you actually have a look at this, if you look at the one on the screen on the left, you can see that when this all kicked off, there are about 125 horses leaving the gate. So these are vaccines in development, you know, and they were at various stages. So in June last year, there was only one particular, vaccine in large scale, test in phase 3 clinical trials. None have been licensed. If we look at June this year, okay, June the 8th this year, you can see that basically a lot of those horses didn't even leave the blocks, all right? But now we've got a whole multitude coming through this pipeline. But also, look, you have abandoned products. So this is where people have invested loads and loads of cash into them, in those various trials, but then they've had to abandon them because they're not achieving what was there. And actually now we just have approved 8 which are fully approved. This will be slightly US centric, and we've got 7 which are in early or limited use. So that's, if you like, the journey that we're going through. You've got this pipeline which is actually taking place. So let's just think about the networks then, and I'm not going to go through these in detail, but just to give you a quick sort of insight into the types of people you need to get involved to make these things work. So first of all, you need company creation people, so if I'm going to launch my own little vaccine, or Oxford University or another company is doing, you need lawyers, management consultants, accountants, you need the corporate finance, you need angel investors, venture capitalists, corporate communications, of course, HR, and then information technology as well. So those are just some of the types of things you need to get sorted out up front. What you then need to think about is your technology network and your funding network. So, the technology network could involve platform technology people, academics, corporate communications. So you actually need to get all that into place, but also then you need your funding network. So corporate services, accounts, lawyers, corporate finance, HR, venture capitalists, fund the management team. And I think that's something really important to think about, that, at the end of the day, what they will do is put money behind names often. So what you'll find with these biotech companies, they try and get onto the board as non-exec directors or directors, real big names. So I can imagine at the moment those great people who actually developed the Oxford vaccine, they'll be under a lot of, there'll be a lot of jobs being offered to them of, can you sit on the board of our, our directors or non-exec, or can you do this, or can you do that? So, that becomes really important, because that will then enable people to actually fund the team and have more confidence in funding the team. Now, when we start to think about the funding evolution for discovery, you can see here the amounts of money involved are relatively low, and then you start moving through, and then you're having to push sort of millions at it. So you can sort of get going with tens of thousands, but then as you start moving through, you're moving into millions, and typically it can take around about 5 years to get there. Now, it's slightly different with platform technology. These are sort of more medical devices and things like that. So you can more or less go through these much quicker, because the regulatory environment is slightly different in terms of those. So if you're thinking about a you know, a lateral flow test or something like that, or some technology associated with that. Or, I mean, they're just talking about now having a breathalyzer for COVID, or sensors in airplanes which can just monitor the atmosphere and that will detect COVID. You know, it'll smell COVID. So, you know, those types of technologies are a little bit easier to be able to move through. Now, let's just think about then that some of the product characteristics associated with the current approved vaccines which we have sort of you know, out there. This is just from BBC research, but you can see Pfizer. One of the key things is storage, -80 to -60. You can keep it for 6 months, so if you can do that. But then really it's 2 to 8 degrees at 5 days. Now I think that might have changed actually. They may now have approval to keep it for a longer period of time, up to maybe 30 days. I'm sure I saw something about that. So this is changing all the time within the regulatory environment. Moderna, similar, but it's frozen food. So, you know, that's something we're a little bit more used to. We've then got, if you like, those are the RNA, these, you know, these very new vaccine technologies. We've got viral vector, and you can see that these are 2 to 8 Celsius, and you can keep them for 6 months. So this is really great because, you know, to be quite honest, yogurt has less of a shelf life than some of these products. So, you know, I'm more worried about moving yogurt through my supply chain than maybe the vaccines through the supply chain. But you can see that these 2 to 8 degrees, 6 months. We've got the Jensen one as well, similarly. We've then got inactivated virus. These are ones which, you know, which are, you know, some of the Chinese ones here. So you can see those. And then we've also got one called Novax, which is another technology again. But actually, you know, the product characteristics are actually quite important when you're actually thinking through this, because that, of course, has massive challenges for the supply chain. So, you know, these ultra cold freezers, as it were, need quite a lot of power. So you can't just get them and plug them into a 13 amp plug. You know, I would probably have to plug one of these ultra cold freezers into my my electric vehicle charging point at 7 kilowatts to be able to keep it going. So they do use quite a bit of energy. So you have to think through all that when you're actually putting these things in place. Now, this is me at my local vaccination centre. Very small unit, but we're able to basically vaccinate 1 person per minute. We're generally open from 8 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night. But the point I want to make here is that it's not just about that vaccine turning up, okay? So the Pfizer vaccine, I'll be quite honest, is a really difficult product for me in the vaccination centre. And the reason is because the vials come, we then have to dilute with saline before we actually draw the vaccine into syringes to go to the our individual clients, as it were, who are receiving the vaccination. So, you know, you get a vial, and then effectively you've got to dilute with saline, and then you pull, you know, they have to pull off using a separate syringe again to, you know, the number of doses from that particular vial. We use low latency syringes. Why is that important? Because it actually means we can get additional doses out of the vial. These things hold, they have nothing. If you think about it, a syringe has the needle, and then it has a bit of a dead zone in it, yeah? So you lose, you know, for every jab you give somebody, some stuff is left in the syringe. But one of the things we've been doing is using low latency syringes. What that does is, on an AstraZeneca, for example, you get a vial of 8, or we get a vial of 10, and we'll probably get about 9 out of an 8 pretty regularly, and we can get 12 out of a 10 pretty regularly by using those syringes. So that has an impact on our supply chain. Just some of the things here. I mean, whiteboards, really important. And one, whiteboard pens. You can't believe it. if we don't have whiteboard pens, that can shut the whole process down. I know it sounds ridiculous, but we have to write down, because of the records we have to keep on it, who's giving the jab, who's drawn the jab, and everything else. And so you've got data entry people, and it's a very fast environment where people are coming through and everything else. But we have to make time for people because so some of those people are in quite if you've got sort of 80, 90-year-olds in wheelchairs, it can be quite a challenge just managing those people through the process. Now, here's the great thing. My vaccination manager, she actually is an automation engineer by background. Our area got a mention in Houses of Parliament because our little unit was just doing so many people and getting them through in a very caring way. Lots of volunteers, so we'll have medical staff and everything else, but an awful lot of volunteers. So you might have a core team of maybe 4 or 5 people who are, if you like, paid for people, but then we have to have another 15 or more people who are volunteers, multitasking, working within this environment. Wipeable chairs, I mentioned that one because originally we didn't have that, and the alcohol wipes to sterilize them. You can see one of the non-wipeable chairs behind me in that photo. They're vinyl covered, very comfortable. But once you wipe them with alcohol wipes, I don't know how many times, they started to dissolve. So we had to actually change those as well. So, all sorts of little things which I could talk long and hard about, but I'm not going to around this. But if you've got any questions around it, please ask. But the point I'm trying to make here, it has to be like a well choreographed ballet so that everything comes together, everything's available. The way we manage the process, really, really important. And that's, if you like, at the actual sharp end. Our centre has also been having to manage, basically, we prefer just to be doing AstraZeneca's or Pfizer, but at the moment we're doing AstraZeneca and Pfizer, and then you've got to make sure you've got the processes in place so that somebody doesn't get the wrong jab. All right, although, to be quite honest, the jury's out, but mainly we're doing Pfizer now because we're getting into younger age groups within the so under 40s now. We're using the Pfizer and the Modernas because there's less chance. But Pfizer and Modernas, one of the challenges we have, people have to stay in the center for 15 minutes, okay, because there is more likelihood of a quick reaction, shock reaction to those jabs, whereas with AstraZeneca, you can't drive for 15 minutes, but you can leave the center. So, there's even different nuances. So I can end up on Pfizer with the whole center, and I'm often involved in sort of trying to manage, and they call it observation infection control. Basically I wipe anything that isn't moving, and I have these lounges and I'm having to manage those, and we can fill those up quite quickly if we're not careful. So lots of little stories associated there. Okay, let's move on very quickly to supply chain risk. So going back to where we started from, foundation of effective supply chain strategy, absolutely critical for this. Understand the supply chain strategy, understand how you're creating value. Product and service design for the supply chain is key to resilience because you lock in a lot of the risk profile of the supply chain at that stage. So you must think about that. So, I'll be quite honest, Pfizer, great product. It's great to have the vaccine, but from a supply chain perspective, it's hard work, right? So I'm sure that, in terms of the development, they're trying to work out easier ways of actually doing that. Collaboration, managing relationships, absolutely key. And I think we've probably already emphasized that, how relationships are managed, that network is very important. Agility, that flexibility is really required. A culture of risk management. And what I mean by that is when people make a decision, for example, a procurement decision, they ask the question, how will this impact on the risk profile of my supply chain? Supply chain design and engineering, the networks put in place, but really key, and this is something we've seen come on leaps and bounds in the last 18 months, is supply chain transparency and continuous monitoring and intelligence. So this is this temple. If you go onto LinkedIn and you follow my newsletter, you'll find more of a description on this. But this is absolutely critical to get these elements in place, and we're starting to see these elements being rolled out. Now, I just want to mention a couple of things. ESG, environment, social governance risks, really important. So this is for an electric vehicle battery. I just pulled this in an hour ago, because I'll just show you this, because what's important about this is that we are starting to map these things globally. It's really important to map these things globally as we're moving forward. Why? Because it's now on the agenda for institutional investors. Okay, so what we're starting to find is that banks are under pressure not to loan money to businesses who aren't really considering ESG risks. And we're starting to find that fund managers, these people who are buying and investing in companies, over the last 3 years, strategies associated with this have gone from 65 to 77%. And hey, just a few months ago, Germany to implement a supply chain law against exploitation, but it talks about labor or environmental abuses in the global supply chain. Okay, so you as a director can be held to account for environmental abuses in your supply chain. So transparency, continuous monitoring and intelligence, absolutely critical on this, and understanding your ESG risks. So then, if we're thinking about the journey we're going on to the new normal or the new better, we've gone through lockdown. We have PreNew Normal. And what's important about PreNew Normal is this is using your existing processes, existing infrastructure, existing information systems, and existing people to basically manage the supply chain where the value has actually changed. So if you think about, for example, online delivery, if you're still picking in a supermarket and putting it on a lorry and driving it to customers, that it has a very high cost to serve in comparison with having, say, a dark store where you've actually optimized things in that environment. So PreNew Normal is really using all the old stuff which we had before all this happened to actually accommodate the new stuff. We're then moving into the new normal or the new better. And this is about a year old, this slide, but we were predicting, if you like, going through a number of cycles on this. So this is really important as we move forward. Big debate which has taken place is, as we're seeing now, infrastructure and property and information technology. Big trade-off between these two. A couple of examples here. KPMG investing 44 million to implement new working model this year, with the majority spent on home working. But guess what? They're also closing a load of offices. And then we've got Vodafone, who's talking about, COVID has made the old style office obsolete. So we built a new flexible model, putting working from home on equal footing. Now that is talking about us as individuals working at home, but actually exactly the same thing is going on in the supply chain. So our information technology, basically infrastructure, property, human resources, how do we manage in that virtual world, and therefore the new processes which are taking place. So building resilience for the new normal or the new better. A couple of big lessons which come out. Procure for resilience rather than for cost is really something which is really key, and we're starting to see occurring. We're having to explore onshoring, and we can do that because the new technologies from Supply Chain 4.0 are actually completely changing, if you like, the amount of the cost of labor, as it were, right? Because if we're able to use more robotics, more automation and things like that, whether you locate, the key thing is locate it close to your customer. Can we locate manufacturing close to our customer? We may do nearshoring, but also multi-shoring, not multi-sourcing, right? You might do that, but multi-shoring. And what I mean by that, I was working with one company recently. They said, "Oh yeah, we're multi-sourcing. Really good. We got 3 suppliers on that particular component." Fact was, all 3 of those suppliers were in the same place in the world, and the place was locked down. So you have to think through: can we multi-shore to really create resilience? We've got changing working practices supported by technology. Just because we're now vulnerable to a physical virus, yes, we've got the cyber virus as well, but our supply chains are vulnerable to the physical virus. So how can we deal with that? Innovation, absolutely key. And we're finding that people are taking ideas from different areas and doing that, but also then collaboration, really critical. the networks we're part of, that has proven invaluable to creating resilience. So really, just to close off then, wisdom, skill in life for mastering life's complexities. We have an absolute abundance of data. We have an abundance of information, but the key thing is how can we turn that into knowledge? But ultimately what we have to do is to turn that into wisdom so we know how to act. And if we've got the wisdom, it then points us at the right data to collect, and then we're able to actually go through this cycle again. So I think it's really important to recognize that, yes, we can get a lot of data, we can get a lot of information, but really importantly, the skill set we need to have is one which is, if you like, some wise eyes to be able to sort of identify what we need to do within the supply chains and be able to move forward. So lots of other information that you can get from my website, richardwilding.info. There's bits and pieces on YouTube as well, and there's a free online course as well with about 60,000 subscribers, which you can just download onto iOS. Hopefully it's still working. It's on the iTunes U platform. So a few things there which may be of interest to you. So that's all I'm going to say. I will leave it on that slide, and we can go to questions.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. Very interesting session there, so quite a lot to take in. So in terms of questions, if you have a question, if you could type it into the questions box, then I can pose those to Richard.
And I'm just trying to work out how on earth I stop sharing my screen. That's my next challenge in in this. So if I'm able to do that, that would be really good as well.
You should be. If not, I can try and do it from my side, Richard.
Okay, give it a go.
Okay, well, while we're working out the technology there, perhaps I'll jump in with a question while you're having a think about that. So I was reflecting on everything you did, you talked about there, Richard, lots of interesting stuff. And it strikes me that the question I have about this industry is, we've lost your camera now. You might want to come back, Richard. I don't know how to put this. Is why is the product development process so slow? Is it regulatory issues or whatever? Because what you would seem to have described is the old product development, R&D, product introduction, biotech, pharma, parts of it, is really a sequential product development. And we've known for like 30 or 40 years that we should be using concurrent engineering principles, which is really what your future state of the fast product development in 1 year was looking like. But certainly when in the pre-talk we were talking about moving on to set-based concurrent engineering, where the set was the different players in the supply chain, which is what you're saying is where we could go even better than we've actually done before. So the question is, if we knew all these sort of things, at least in theory and in other industries like the car industry 30 years odd ago, why on earth has this industry been so slow?
Well, I mean, it's interesting, really, if we're looking at sort of different industries and different environments. Pharma, I would say, in some areas is probably ahead of the game, but because of the regulatory environment it's actually had to operate in, to some degree, it drives a very conservative and controlled way in which, and nobody wants to sort of challenge the norm or challenge the status quo. And I think that what's actually happened is that the nature of these of the massive, of the pandemic, it created a burning platform where the status quo could actually be challenged and move forward, and that ultimately changed the culture of what was actually happening within those environments. All of a sudden, people found that they could do things very, very differently. But I mean, also, I just Peter, and I think you find this, is the good news for people like yourself and myself is that corporate memory is very short. So, generally what we find is that, a lot of these fundamental principles that we have been talking about for 30 years, I would argue that we now have new people, new teams, new demographics involved. And actually they haven't had that, if you like, formal education. So if I think about supply chain professionals, for example, many have not had any formal supply chain education, you know, just understanding some of the fundamental building blocks of the subject area. They've picked it up as they've been, you know, on the job. And the problem is with doing stuff on the job, you know, if you think that, you know, maybe 100% of the knowledge, if you're doing it on the job, you're only going to use probably 5 or 10% of the knowledge, and you're not aware of all this other stuff which is going on. And therefore that starts to create challenges. But as I said, the good news for you and me is it means that we can still carry on presenting lean principles to people. We can still carry on, you know, telling people about these new ways of working. And to be quite honest, some of the roots of that go back many, many years, you know, and I think that that's really important. I mean, last year I was spending a lot of time talking about, you know, what will happen when people build stocks. And of course, that goes back to, you know, the Forrester effect, 1958, which was then rebranded as the bullwhip effect in 1997, and so on and so forth. Many senior supply chain people in blue chip companies had no idea about those particular common effects and the fact that they can actually trigger them through their actions.
Yes, well, what it's called for is some really good university courses in the sort of east of England area, I think, Richard. So one for you. So while people are thinking, I don't know if we're going to get more questions coming in. So what I was, you know, we were talking a little bit before people were with us about, you know, that some of the challenges in the UK have been handled better in terms of getting the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine through than perhaps in some other countries. So would you like to reflect on, you know, what worked there and perhaps what didn't work in other areas?
Okay, so I think that one of the key things which actually took place was that the person who was in charge of that, the lady's background was actually, she was a venture capitalist, but she had good experience of the pharmaceutical industry. So it was basically in March when they really started, February, March, believe it or not, 2020, where the vaccines task force was more or less pulled together. And she was put in charge of it. And that actually gave her quite a different perspective on things, because what she realized, and going back to that particular slide I showed you, you know, from the New York Times, she was going to have to back some horses, right? So what they did was the UK government started procuring, so they actually mobilized procurement quite early on. And one of the first things that they actually mobilized in procurement was, because of their experience, they knew the bottlenecks in the supply chain. And one of the big bottlenecks in, if you like, pharmaceutical vaccine supply chain is fill and finish, which is where you're able to put that vaccine into a vial so that it can be distributed. And what they were able to do was they procured all the capacity of one big, you know, manufacturer in the United Kingdom, saying this is what we want you to actually do. So that was one of the key things there. And then, you know, once they had identified those horses to back, those vaccines to back, they started actually putting in the, you know, started to really fund that well to enable that could actually be accelerated forward. And of course, they got, you know, our, you know, the medicines agencies and everybody involved, actively involved at an early stage. Interestingly enough, they also got involved, the information systems people. So I know that some of the big information systems providers were basically being contacted in May, June last year. Okay, even though the vaccines weren't going out, they, you know, they knew that back end of 2020, they would need to have those all that information systems capability in place. So they were actually brought on board then, but also the logistics providers as well. So the logistics providers were brought on board and were being taught to about that. So the logistics providers, rather than being told in December, oh, by the way, you've got something you've got to move and it's going to be this temperature, they were brought on board, and the information systems associated with that had to be in place. So if you think about going back to my little simple model of process, infrastructure, equipment, information systems, and people, what we actually saw was, if you like, a rapid engagement around that very, very early on in terms of what was going. And also procurement, very pragmatic procurement, because what they said was that they would pay for manufacture at risk. And that is, that was unheard of. So what they were saying to the manufacturers is, we want you to manufacture at risk, okay? So in other words, until that product is actually formally approved, there's no sign that there's no chance, it might not be approved. So all that.
So who would pay for it if it didn't get approved?
Well, that's right. If it didn't get approved, that was a serious risk, to an organization. But through collaboration, through building the relationships, through the support, they realized we're going to have to start manufacturing at risk. So that manufacturing at risk actually started in probably August, and the approvals didn't take place on, Pfizer was approved, I think that was early December, I've got the date somewhere, but AstraZeneca was about a month later, okay? So, up until then, they had the stockpiles in place to start rolling it out, for people to actually start, receiving their jabs. So really, we talk about the success of that. There's no doubt about it. It was, some excellent planning. If you have a look on the government website, you can actually go and download those reports on, the whole vaccine strategy. They're very open about it, giving examples. They knew they needed to mobilize volunteers. They knew that they were going to have to create centers. So all those things were being played out. They got the military. If you think about the parties involved, they had the military involved, because you're in a product launch supply chain. You need people who can broker things pretty rapidly with government as well. That's one thing the military are very good at doing, getting national resource behind things. So they got the military involved. They got an army of volunteers involved. They had, the health service involved as well. So, there's this whole network of people involved to be able to make this successful as it rolled out.
Yeah, good. Okay, we've got a couple of questions coming in from the audience. So the first one is from Simon, who says, what are your thoughts on the longer term impact of the demand swings linked to the Forrester effect with the market stimulus and significant disruption in global freight? Oh, hold on, another question came in. Global freight on inflation. There's a lot of sort of big trends being sparked off.
So at the moment, what we've got a horribly volatile environment, and it's not just on global freight. So it's not even on containers, air freight. It's also, even if you're looking at freight at a local level, so even in the United Kingdom, if you're looking at some of the challenges with freight availability just in lorries and everything else, things are incredibly volatile. And I think that what we're going to see is an awful lot of noise in the system for quite a while. And part of the challenge we have with global freight is, to be quite frank, all the containers are in all the wrong places and lead times have extended. So for example, if you're trying to get things out of ports, lead times are extended. So there's COVID at the moment. You might have picked up on it, but the mainstream media don't seem to be talking very much about it, actually. But there's been an outbreak of COVID. I think it's in the Guangdong district, and that has meant that ships are waiting to get into the port. So there's a massive backlog of ships trying to get get into that port. But also, if you look at the US, similar things were happening recently there on the West Coast, that because of COVID, the capacity to be able to get ships in and unload them was a real big challenge. So I often say it's a bit like a supermarket, trolleys at a supermarket. You want them all by the door. Problem is then the extremities of the car park, and you've got to have somebody who can collect them and bring them back to the door. And at the moment, in the old normal, that would work just through the normal trade lanes. Now, at the moment, because of the disruption to flows, this isn't happening. So it's not just forest to demand amplification bullwhip. It's also parallel interactions. Parallel interaction, for example, because air freight's all of a sudden, we're not flying around people, therefore, the top of the plane was people, in the hold was air freight. All of a sudden that's gone. So now you're having to charter planes to do this. You get this knock-on effect occurring across multiple supply chains. So we've got that parallel interactions as well.
Okay, great. So another question here from Clive. He says, what do you believe are the main learnings from the vaccine supply chain and wider industry, and especially SMEs, need to consider?
I think it's very much collaboration. It is very much around management of relationships. Okay, and when I say management of relationships, I mean managing relationships. The problem is most people think the relationships just happen by accident. But if you're managing inventory, for example, you will have key performance indicators on inventory. You will probably have information systems for monitoring inventory. You will probably even have, resource for storing inventory. You need exactly the same for relationships. Well, maybe you won't store relationships, but you've got to have performance indicators. You may need information systems for supporting the management of relationships. So this becomes really, really quite important. And you also need that skill set. So we talk about the technical intelligence of the supply chain. You also need the EQ, emotional intelligence, or relational intelligence of the supply chain. So if I was going to, an SME needs to think location, location, location. They need to know where their suppliers are located, where their customers are located, and the flows through that network, right? That's one thing. But then they've got to start managing relationships and learning how to really manage relationships effectively across that supply chain. So then collaborate, collaborate, collaborate.
But also from the SME's point of view, there must be advantages on some of the, reshoring or nearshoring. So for instance, possibility to win more business on a local basis as well. Massive
opportunities, really. But I mean, we're always going to have global sourcing. We can't do everything. If you think about, electric vehicle supply chain, unless somebody finds masses of lithium in Cornwall, we're still going to have global supply chains. But I think what we're going to start finding is it's going to be probably manufacturing more local to the customers wherever they are. You're still going to have manufacturing in China. Why? Because there's an awful lot of customers in China. But you're going to probably also find that onshoring and reshoring into more, local markets for that environment.
Okay, we got, I think, 2 questions here from Marco, so I'll just do them one by one. So he says, thanks for the brilliant presentation. Curious to know, so the first one is, any information is available on vaccine producers or NHS figuring out decoupling points, then deciding which vaccines to buy, considering the various market-winning features of storage, dosage, requirements, etc.?
I haven't seen anything which is, let's say, open source on that currently. You will find, I mean, really a good starting point is just go on to the UK Gov website and find their report, which let me just whiz back. I don't know if you can see my presentation or not now.
Yeah, we still got it. We've got the wisdom
because I bombed out of the system. I don't know if you noticed that, but I ended up at one point while you were talking. I crashed out of out of what was going on. Let me just see if I can find that that slide. I'm not sure if I can navigate it now. Actually, for some strange reason, it's not working.
Okay, well, not to
No,
worry.
it seems to,
yeah.
I'll tell you what, if I can give you the, oh, share my screen. Okay, I'll try that.
Yeah, I've just popped that back on for you, Richard. So that should allow
Hang
you to
on a minute.
share it now.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm just going to have to reopen the presentation. For some reason, I did bomb out the joys of doing online. Right, let me just find it. Here we go, it's here. So if I just share my screen on this one here. Does that actually work here? Oh, what am I sharing?
You got lots of screens open.
Lots
there.
and lots of screens. Okay, how do I unshare my screen?
Just need to maximize the presentation one.
Yeah, hang on a minute. Yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. Right, and then actually what I will do, sorry folks, showing my incompetence in this conferencing platform. Let me just need to change my slideshow setup and then it should flood the screen. Okay, so pow, right. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So if you just look for UK COVID-19 vaccines delivery plan, okay, that will give you an awful lot of the information that you need. So that's a good starting point. There are little mini cases and links there, so that might be quite useful.
Okay, good. Let's go on to his second question. So as lean and agile experts, would you agree that not only those but all supply chain techniques become more effective if they're pursued as an organizational learning experience that assured lasting results?
Right, I think this might be referring to sometimes the process of implementing the principle is more important to the organization than the results you get in the end. That makes sense. So I often say if you're thinking about, you know, we were talking about this, weren't we? Time-based process mapping, for example. To be quite honest, you know, one of the process of doing time-based process mapping, the results from that for the organization, because it actually gets people working together, learning together, understanding the nature of that process within the business, etc., is more important than that final deliverable map you get in the end. So having, if you like, low risk projects which create value for all parties becomes really, really important within the supply chain to make these things happen. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but hopefully it does.
Okay, good. Well, time's up, but let's just take the last question that's come in before we close down. So this one's from Brett, who says, how do you think the vaccine supply chain has performed on a global scale? What supply network challenges have you seen that are limiting global access to vaccines?
Right. Well, I think that what we're having to remember here is we are basically building a supply chain to inoculate the world. And even in the United Kingdom, if you actually think to what actually had to happen, we effectively had to build what is the equivalent of a you know, a whole national supermarket supply chain within a matter of weeks to be able to do the vaccination project. Now, when we start to actually think about what we're trying to do in vaccinating the world, we have got to get the manufacturing capacity up. We've got to be able to actually have this going. So AstraZeneca was quite astute, because what they wanted to do is, because it's not for profit, and I think this is something we mustn't forget, that AstraZeneca, the AZ vaccine, is not for profit. That was part of the insistence of the Oxford team, that basically until this is done, it should be not for profit. That doesn't mean that all the costs have to be covered, but what was happening was that the price of that vaccine in a particular location has to just cover the cost. So there is a different price for it in the United Kingdom than it is in Europe, than it is in India, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the things that they're having to do. And what they're having to do is to actually get that capacity up in these various places. Part of the problem with that, as we've seen, is some of the geopolitical challenges. So I think one of the other lessons that we've seen is once you get politicians trying to get involved with supply chains, they can really disrupt them pretty quickly. So, you know, we need to recognize we need that free trade. We need to be able to, you know, make sure that that manufacturing capability is being built and we're up to speed. The problem is with vaccines, it's very much a live product. It's, you know, an analogy is more like it's like making a mature cheddar, you know, it's or a beer, you know, a craft beer. You don't quite know what you're going to get out of it until you get out the end. Now, that was always the case when we were making beer, but now it's a very, very reliable process. And some of the manufacturing facilities for vaccines are becoming increasingly reliable now, but there is still, you know, it's still not quite right, which is why we've heard things like batches being withheld and so on and so forth. But the key thing is we've got to get capacity out there. Please, politicians, just, you know, do the right thing and, you know, allow, if you like, the raw materials for vaccines and everything else to be moved. But we've got big capacity constraints as well, you know, just on glass. I mean, if you're looking at medical glass for the vials, there is a massive shortage of that out there. So it's not just about the vaccine, it's can we have the things to put it in? Can we have the PPE? It's those 80 items as well. Chairs that don't dissolve under alcohol wipes. You know, it's a crazy supply chain.
Great. Well, I think time is now against us. I've just sort of picked out 7 key aspects that seem to have come out of the conversation. So hopefully Richard will agree with these, or at least some of them anyway. So one is that last conversation about learning from our experiences so we can be faster and better in the future. The pragmatic procurement that was part of the solution, the risk assessment and the resilience, the relationship management, some of the agile thinking that you talked about, as well as sort of looking at bottlenecks in the supply chain and managing those one by one, and the set-based concurrent engineering. So I think for me, those seem to be the 7 pointers that perhaps we could take away, and we could all contemplate whether or not we're in this supply chain or another. All of those thoughts might be worth thinking about. So thank you very much, Richard. That was a great, fantastic talk. So
thank you very much, Peter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thanks, Peter, and thank you for everyone attending. So you'll receive a follow-up email from myself, which is always great for you to give us some feedback, and also for Richard as well, which we'll pass on to you. And yes, look out for our future webinars through our website or the Lean Business Systems, where Peter usually uploads them sort of every fortnightly. So look out for those. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Great. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
Richard. Bye.